Today I'm going to be talking about vitamin D, which technically speaking is a hormone. There are two forms of vitamin D, which I'll review. There aren't very many food sources of vitamin D, but I'll briefly go over those. And we will talk about the function of vitamin D, as well as why you might be deficient, whether you live in a warm or cold climate, and what optimal 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels look like, and if you are deficient, what treatment might look like. We know that vitamin D is a worldwide epidemic, meaning that no matter where you live, you are more than likely to be deficient. And those that are deficient in vitamin D typically have what we call nonspecific musculoskeletal pain. And that, of course, could be a symptom of multiple other diseases. So it's hard to diagnose on symptom alone, which is why we have a blood test that we can do. People that have vitamin D deficiency often have poor balance. They have difficulty walking upstairs. They have difficulty rising or getting up out of a chair. But again, these things can mimic a lot of other diseases. If you are obese, you're likely vitamin D deficient because vitamin D, since it is fat soluble, is sequestered or stored in the adipose tissue, and it's unavailable. So once it's there, it's not likely to be released. The two forms of vitamin D that I was referring to are vitamin D3, which is what you'd find in a supplement bottle in an aisle at your big box store or at the grocery store. And we as humans make that vitamin D from that form of vitamin D from sunlight exposure, as well as animals do the same. And vitamin D2 is found primarily in plants and yeasts, and that is what the form that you would get if your doctor prescribed vitamin D treatment for your suboptimal levels or insufficient levels. There aren't very many food sources that are rich in vitamin D. I think most people know that fatty fishes, dairy, tend to be the go-to sources, or what we would think of when we think of vitamin D sources, but they're really they don't contain a lot of vitamin D. And if someone said to me, I'm going to treat myself with food, I'm going to treat my vitamin D deficiency by consuming food sources rich in vitamin D, I would probably have to say good luck, because really the one food source, if you want to call it that, where you could get maybe enough vitamin D if you took multiple tablespoons would be cod liver oil. And I'm really not going to recommend that for anyone. So why do we even care about vitamin D deficiency, or why is it important? Well, I think most people know if you want a healthy skeleton, you need to have adequate or optimal calcium absorption, which you can't do without vitamin D. That's why when you buy calcium pills, they often, more often than not, will contain vitamin D. So you can see with vitamin D, you absorb upwards of 50% of the calcium that you ingest. And of course, when we take calcium, we want to take it in divided doses, no more than 500 or 600 milligrams at a time, because otherwise it's not going to be absorbed. In terms of bone mineralization, that's what we're referring to is how dense is that bone. So, for example, in children, we see rickets, where the bone is like a green stick that's easily bendable when that bone is not mineralized due to vitamin D deficiency because of the poor calcium absorption. And in adults, that manifests itself as osteoporosis, which we're likely more familiar with because we really, thankfully, don't see rickets anymore in this country. While most people are probably familiar with vitamin D in relationship to bone health and possibly musculoskeletal health, some people don't think about vitamin D deficiency related to disease, such as cancer or autoimmune disorders. And the reality is that vitamin D is a hormone. It's primarily made in the kidney, and it can exert an effect on all tissues in the body. Each cell in the body has a vitamin D receptor, and we know that the active form of vitamin D, the 1,25-hydroxy dihydroxy D, regulates more than 200 genes. So you can see the potential implications in terms of gene expression and potential impact on all aspects of disease and health. Again, that's hotly debated, but the potential is there, given, again, that you have, I'm going to say it again, you have a vitamin D receptor in every single cell in your body. So I've listed the cancers for you that if you went to the literature and searched for vitamin D and cancer, these are some of the ones that might be listed with some of the research that you might find. But also there are implications of vitamin D deficiency related to autoimmune diseases such as multiple sclerosis. Interestingly, I live in Maine, and for a very long time, a number of years ago, the thought was that the paper mills, which have now gone overseas, might be contributing to the rise in number of cases of multiple sclerosis. Now they're thinking it's more closely related to vitamin D deficiency. But what you need to remember is that these environmental factors interact with your genes, because if vitamin D deficiency is implicated in any number of these diseases, anyone who is vitamin D deficient would get these diseases. So you have to remember that the two of those interact, environment and genes. We all have different genes, obviously. In terms of immunity, if you think about it, especially this year, it's been horrible with upper respiratory illnesses, pneumonia, influenza. They occur in the winter when vitamin D levels are likely at their lowest, or when people are likely most deficient. Way back when, we're talking the times of the Greeks, they would put people on the sunny side of the hill as the sun came up and let them be exposed to sunlight because they found that it treated TB. So you can see that there is a role with vitamin D in immunity. And again, you would find that in the literature too. I believe I've posted some articles about that. The recommended dietary allowances, they were revised in 2010, and some would argue that they're not set high enough. The tolerable upper limit of D is 4,000 international units. In order to treat someone, you must use a dose higher than that under a physician's recommendation or guidance. So, as I had said before, previously, when we first started, the primary way, we primarily make vitamin D through sun exposure. So when sunlight hits our skin, there's something called 7-dehydrocholesterol, which is secreted from the cells in the epidermis and dermis to the surface of the skin. And upon exposure to UVB radiation from sunlight, pre-vitamin D3 is formed. And that hangs around in the skin for 2 to 3 days, where it's converted to vitamin D3. And that D3 is bound to D-binding protein, vitamin D-binding protein, where it's transported to the liver for the first hydroxylation reaction. It continues on its way, on its path, to the kidney, where the second hydroxylation reaction occurs. And you end up with the active form 1,25-dihydroxy vitamin D. And as I told you previously, that is the active form, but that is not the form that we measure when we draw your blood to see what your vitamin D status is. In terms of sunlight and vitamin D, again, we get vitamin D primarily from sunlight exposure. As I've said, you really can't consume enough food sources to get adequate vitamin D. So 90 to 100% of our requirement for vitamin D comes from the sun. Now think about that for a minute, because some dermatologists, and understandably so, get quite nervous when we start saying things like this. We know that sunlight, damage from sunlight, can cause basal cell and squamous cell carcinoma, and the big bad one, malignant melanoma. So we don't want to be advising people to unnecessarily expose themselves to the sun, but at the same time, we need the sunlight to make vitamin D. So there's quite the conundrum there. Summer skin synthesis. So there's somebody, let's just say she's in the Caribbean now, and I'm very jealous. We talk about an erythemal dose, and that is the amount of sunlight that you need as an individual to just begin to turn your skin pink. And that generally produces 10,000 to 25,000 international units of vitamin D. Now think about that for a minute. The recommendations that I just showed you for the folks that were 70 or older were 800 international units daily. And look how much you can produce just from a little bit of sunlight. You can't become toxic from vitamin D with sunlight exposure. Thank goodness. Some of us would be in trouble. In terms of skin biosynthesis, just 5 to 10 minutes on your arms if you're fair-skinned. In June or July around where I live will give you about 3,000 international units. You can see what it'd be if you lived on the Cape. So all I'm trying to show you or illustrate is that you can produce a tremendous amount of vitamin D from minimal sun exposure. You can't get that from your food sources. All right, so here we are in Maine in the winter, and what's happening now? Well, certainly not making any vitamin D. We just got 30 inches of snow. Yay! And I have to tell you, the day after the storm was absolutely beautiful here. It was sunny. It doesn't matter how much I shoveled in the sunlight, I was not making vitamin D. There's a reason for that. So we also know, or I should point out, that vitamin D levels are not stable. They change. They peak in September, so you really wouldn't want to draw your vitamin D level in September if you were questioning whether or not you were deficient. Usually it's recommended you can draw the level at any time, but ideally I would say late February, which is approaching, or early March. So that's something to discuss with your physician if you're questioning whether or not you might be deficient. There is a line, latitude, we talk about when we determine vitamin D, ideal vitamin D synthesis during the year. This line shows 34 degrees north latitude, and the line is drawn through Los Angeles and Columbia, South Carolina. So anyone north of that line will not be making vitamin D in the winter. That would be me, way up here in Maine. There's a picture of my husband and I snowshoeing. It was actually not this winter, but a previous winter. And you can see on the slide that you have an 80 to 100% decrease in that UVB radiation above that line that I just showed you from the months of November to February. So welcome to Maine. You won't be making any vitamin D during those months. So people are it's a little bit misleading. People think that on a bright sunny day in the winter when they're skiing, because they might get even a little bit of color, that they're making adequate vitamin D, and they in fact are not. So in terms of how much vitamin D we make or synthesize from exposure on our skin depends on where the sun is in the sky, the time of the day, the season, as I've just talked to you about, and the latitude. And I might add, I have to, excuse me while I use my props to illustrate a point. So this is what we see with those folks in the southern climates. And they often think that because they live in the South, they certainly get enough sun exposure and therefore could not possibly be vitamin D deficient. My brother and his family live in Texas. Let me tell you, it's SPF 100, and they run from one air-conditioned location to the next. And I can't say that I blame them. If you've ever been to Texas, it's a great state, wonderful barbecue, but it is quite hot. And many people are concerned about sun exposure in relation to skin cancer and, of course, causing wrinkles. So hence the hat and the big sunglasses, which also I might add, my understanding is are quite fashionable. So the point that I had made in the beginning, that if you think you live in a southern climate, that you're not at risk for vitamin D deficiency, you quite frankly are wrong. Most makeup that women wear has an SPF of 8 or above. So you're likely not getting that much exposure, sun exposure, to produce adequate vitamin D. Most people are covered up, and we don't tend to run around in our bathing suits much unless we're at the pool or the lake or the ocean, wherever it is that you might wear your bathing suit. If it's cloudy, you won't be making as much vitamin D from sun exposure, or if there's air pollution, again, that will limit your vitamin D production. If you have darker skin, I have quite fair skin, that's why I have the hat and the sunglasses, you will need a little bit longer sun exposure to make adequate vitamin D if your skin is pigmented or darker. And perhaps I should take my sunglasses off because I can't see my screen now. So there are sun exposure guidelines. We don't want the dermatologist getting upset with us, and again, rightly so. You have to, if you can, this is a formula that's been devised, you estimate how long you can be in the sun without actually burning, and then you divide that by the number 4, the factor of 4, and that amount of time is when or how long you expose your face and hands to 2 to 3 times per week, and then you put on your SPF, 50 or 100 or whatever it is that you use. And remember that if there's clouds or pollution that day, it's going to increase the amount of time required. And that comes from Dr. Hollick, who, as I think I mentioned, is in fact a dermatologist. And he's got in trouble with his peers. He's very well respected in the vitamin D world, but there's been some push-pull there with his colleagues in the field of dermatology. You can read about that. In terms of practical applications, you want to be safe. You don't want to burn, you don't want skin cancer, and you don't want wrinkles. No more than 10 minutes a day. And then you really need to cover up and use your sunscreen. If you have fair skin like I do, you'll need less time than somebody who's a little bit more darkly pigmented. Yes, SPF 15 or higher. I prefer 50 to 100. It makes me feel better. I'm told there isn't that much of a difference, but it makes me feel better. Supplement. You're likely going to need to supplement vitamin D during the winter, or go to the Caribbean, or do both. I recommend both. Have your physician check your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level. Now remember, that first hydroxylation reaction occurs in the liver. It is not the active form. And I'm sure you're thinking, why am I telling you this? Well, I'm going to tell you what, a lot of the practitioners aren't aware of what it is they need to order to get when they order that blood draw. So if you know, you can tell them. You can say, no, it's a 25-hydroxy D level, not a 125. So you do need to remember that to tell them. I would get my vitamin D level checked anyway, and most practitioners are willing to do it. But especially if you've got osteoporosis, certain cancers, autoimmune diseases, if you have had a vitamin D deficiency in the past, certainly it warrants checking periodically to make sure that your levels are where they need to be. Again, the best time to check is the time that we're in right now, end of winter. Yay! March. So think about checking your D levels. Now this is interesting. The reference ranges were made by sampling the general population, which researchers didn't realize were inherently deficient. So there's been this great debate about whether even the reference ranges are correct. But this is what they go with. So you can see what the reference range is when you get your lab back. You can compare. Optimal is what we like to see people at, obviously, greater than 80 nanomoles per liter. However, if you want to get in that cancer prevention range, 90 to 120 is where you want to be. If you take too much vitamin D, or if your vitamin D levels are too high, there are detrimental effects, which I'm going to discuss in a minute. So the greater than 75 or the greater than 80 range is let's talk about how you treat someone who is vitamin D deficient. So if you recall, 8 ounces of milk has 120 international units of vitamin D. That's it. In only 100 international 100 international units of vitamin D raises your 25-hydroxy vitamin D levels by 1 nanogram per mil, or 2.5 nanomoles per liter. It's going to depend on your lab what unit they use. So again, when you get the reference range, that will be on your lab sheet for you to determine what your level is. Usually, the way vitamin D deficiency is treated initially is with that vitamin D2 that we talked about, the ergocalciferol, of 50,000 international units once a week times 8 weeks. So in other words, you take a 50,000 international unit, one pill, for 8 weeks, once a week for 8 weeks. And then what they do is they'll recheck your levels to make sure that they're now optimal. So once you've been treated for vitamin D deficiency, the question becomes, excuse me, that is my cat, Mandy the Manx, who is trying to get out. One moment, please. Meet Mandy the Manx. She likes to talk, so she may have something to add to this lecture. So again, once you've been treated with that initial pharmacological dose, you need to have it rechecked, have your 25-hydroxy vitamin D level rechecked. And then it's not a done deal. You've got to maintain your vitamin D levels. And usually that's done, well, it can be done a couple different ways, but the way Dr. Hollick recommends, and he is the godfather of vitamin D, is 50,000 international units once every 2 weeks. Or you can take 1,000 to 2,000 international units of vitamin D3 daily. I would lean more toward a 5,000 international units daily dose. Again, certainly something you want to discuss with your physician, and it is something that you want to monitor. You want to get your vitamin D levels checked and then rechecked periodically. And that's something that insurance is now covering. So if you do think you might be deficient, or you would like to have a baseline vitamin D level, have that discussion with your primary care provider. In terms of intoxication, I'm not referring to the alcohol kind, I'm referring to a toxicity from too much vitamin D. I have a friend who's a toxicologist, which is very cool, but her favorite phrase is the dose makes the poison. So if you think about what that means, Tylenol can help with pain, with fever. Excuse me, that's a brand name. I meant to say acetaminophen. But too much of that can also put you on the liver transplant list. So you have to take the appropriate dose. It's like anything, even with vitamins, in this case hormone, and minerals. People think that just because it's something that you can get over the counter that you can't do any, excuse me, that's Mandy talking, that there's no harm that can be done. That is not the case, and I want you to understand that. You can't become, as I think I pointed out before, toxic with sun exposure, so don't worry about that. However, there have been isolated cases, Mandy is now getting down, where people have consumed toxic amounts of vitamin D. Now, that has happened, in the 2 cases I'm thinking of, through error in production, agricultural production, and it wasn't in this country. There was a case where 10,000 international units were consumed over a period of years that resulted in toxicity, and then there was some type of grain, and I don't quite recall the details, where 1 million international units were consumed daily. And the symptoms of vitamin D toxicity, like the insufficiency or the deficiency, are similar to a lot of other diseases or disorders. They include nausea and vomiting and renal impairment. But what happens, unfortunately, is that you get these deposits of calcium. So you have hypercalcemia, meaning your levels of circulating calcium in the blood are high, and that calcium actually gets deposited in the soft tissues in the body. And you might think, well, big deal. Well, your heart is a soft tissue, so, and your kidneys. That's never a good thing. The tolerable upper intake level is 4,000 international units. That's what's recommended, but if you're being treated, that dose obviously would be much higher on a daily basis. And that concludes my lecture on vitamin D. Please let me know if you have any questions, as always. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.